Basile, if you want me to think that someone deserves punishment, you gotta show me the Carfax, babe. Hello everyone, I hope that you are having a great day wherever you are. My name is Emily and welcome to another episode of If the Slipper Fits, the series where I discuss just about any version of the Cinderella fairy tale that I can get my grubby little hands on. So previously we have talked about a couple of different source texts of Cinderella. And I say that with air quotes because Cinderella, like many other fairy tales, originated in oral storytelling. So the only way that we can really track its movement and evolution through history is looking at the instances where someone actually decided to write it down. We've talked about the French text from Charles Perrault, which is probably the most widely known in modern day. We've talked about the German one from the Brothers Grimm, which is also quite popular, but wildly different. Now we are going to actually take a couple of steps back in time and talk about a man whose name you might not have heard of, and a version of the tale that I would argue got mostly left behind for good reason. That being the story of Cenerentola, also sometimes called La Gatta Cenerentola or the Cat Cinderella, as told by Giambattista Basile. Spoiler alert, she is not actually a cat. Basile was an Italian poet and courtier who was born in 1566 and is best known for his collection of tales called the Pentamerone, which was originally published in 2 volumes, the first in 1634 and the second 2 years later. And as a reminder, that was 63 years before Charles Perrault published his fairy tale collection. The Pentamerone kinda takes an Arabian Nights approach where there is one story that acts as a framing device for why the rest of the tales are being told in rapid succession in the form of the book. In this case, we have 50 stories being told by 10 storytellers over the course of 5 days. I really wanted to find a physical copy of this story at my local library, but I came up empty, so I ended up reading the story as it's transcribed on Wikisource, which was translated by John Edward Taylor. And yeah, no one told me that Wikipedia apparently has a sister website where you can just read a bunch of texts and documents free of charge. Pretty similar to Project Gutenberg, but it's also got stuff like court documents and peace treaties and all sorts of things. I found an executive order from President William Howard Taft reinstating someone into the Forestry Service, which means nothing to me, but still fascinates me. Right, Basile. So I ended up reading the Pentamerone framing story in preparation for why I was actually there, and let me tell you, that was an experience, though it did actually help prime me for Basile's writing style. Perrault and the Grimm Brothers were all pretty straightforward with how they chose to write their respective versions, not to the point of being dry, but just keeping things very simple and not too flowery. But Basile loves him some metaphors. Tadeo, therefore, who could do no otherwise, made necessity kick at discretion. And on that day, at the hour when the star of Venus appears, who awakens the dawn to strew the road along which the sun has to pass, her heart grew so heavy that she was on the point of unpacking the bales of her soul at the custom house of death.
You're unbelievable.
But when I wasn't cracking up at the very Italian purple prose, I was cringing at the blatant and unnecessary racism in this story because the antagonist is a Moorish slave, and the narration really likes to let you know that her apparent ugliness has to do with her being black. Basile! And also Renaissance era Italy at large. Why? I think that's enough tangents, so let's actually get into the Cinderella-related stuff. As usual, I will give you a brief synopsis of the story, just so that we're all on the same page, and then we will come back and discuss. The story opens describing a widowed prince and his daughter. The daughter is called Zezolla, and she is looked after by a governess named Carmosina, who is very kind to her. When Zezolla's father marries again, her new stepmother makes it clear she doesn't like her at all. Zezolla goes to Carmosina for comfort, telling her how she wishes she was her mother instead. Carmosina then explains how Zezolla can make this happen. Zezolla doesn't even question to do as her governess instructs, and asks her stepmother to fetch her an old dress in a large chest. Zezolla holds up the lid so the stepmother can look inside, then drops the lid on top of her, which breaks her neck and kills her. After the mourning period is over, Zezolla begs her father to marry Carmosina. At the wedding celebration, Zezolla is visited by a dove who tells her that if she desires anything, to send word to the dove of the fairies, and her request will be granted. For the next few days, Zezolla, her father, and Carmosina live very happily together. But then Carmosina reveals that she has 6 daughters of her own and brings them all to live in the castle. She convinces the prince to care for each of them very much, and his love for his own daughter fades away. Eventually, Zezolla is forced to sleep in the kitchen rather than her bedroom, and her fine clothes are taken away in exchange for rags. They even begin calling her Cenerentola. One day, the prince has to travel to Sardinia on business and asks each of his stepdaughters what they would like for him to bring back. He then asks Zezolla what she would like, and she tells him to go to the dove of the fairies and ask her to send her something, and if he forgets, he will not be able to travel back home. The prince goes to Sardinia and gets the presents for his stepdaughters, but forgets Zezolla's request. When he is ready to return home, the ship cannot move. The captain of the ship is visited by a fairy in a dream who explains it is because the prince has forgotten his daughter's request. After the captain explains this, the prince does go to the dove of the fairies, who thanks Zezolla for thinking of her, and gives the prince a date tree, a golden hoe, a golden bucket, and a silk napkin to take back to her. Once Zezolla receives her gifts, she immediately plants the date tree in a pot and tends to it with the other items. In only a few days, the tree grows very tall and a fairy steps out of it, asking Zezolla what she wishes for. Zezolla explains that she would sometimes like to leave home without her stepsisters knowing about it. The fairy then teaches Zezolla a rhyme to say to the tree that will help her at such a time. At one point, a king holds a grand ball, and Zezolla's stepsisters get dressed up to attend. Zezolla goes to the date tree and says the rhyme, and she's instantly dressed in a fine gown with a horse and attendants to accompany her. At the ball, her stepsisters are jealous of her beauty, while the king is so struck by her that he orders a servant to figure out who she is. But when Zezolla notices the servant trying to follow her home, she drops some money on the ground, which distracts him enough to let her get away. The king is furious at the servant's failure. After her stepsisters leave for the next ball, Zezolla is given an even more beautiful outfit by the date tree, as well as a coach drawn by 6 horses. The king's servant tries to follow her again, but she drops a handful of pearls, which he is again distracted by, so she can escape. At the third ball, Zezolla arrives in her most beautiful attire and coach yet. This time, the servant keeps close to her when she tries to leave, even running alongside the coach. As she tells the driver to speed up, she loses one of her slippers, which is picked up by the servant and brought to the king. The king makes a proclamation that all the women of the country should attend a banquet, and at this banquet he tries the slipper on all of them to see who it fits, but no one is a perfect match. The king asks everyone to return the next day, reminding them not to leave any girl at home, no matter who she might be. The prince explains he has a daughter, but doesn't think she is worthy to eat with the king, but the king demands she be brought regardless. When Zezolla attends the next day, the slipper flies itself right onto her foot. The king instantly declares his love for her and announces that she will be his queen. The stepsisters are incredibly jealous, but confess to their mother he is a madman who resists the stars. This version is such a trip. Okay, let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room. The fact that Basile apparently looked at Oedipus Rex and said, "Oh, you think that's a plot twist?" When I first read this, swear to God, I thought that the governess was going to wind up being some equivalent of the fairy godmother. I could not have been more wrong. And on one hand, it seems like a pointless addition because she still winds up with a wicked stepmother either way. We just took a longer route to get there. But on the other hand, Carmosina starts out as someone that Zezolla trusts and confides in, someone she sees as a protector. But come to find out that none of that is actually true, and Carmosina only cares about her own daughters. The fact that Zezolla was convinced to commit murder, thinking that it would make everything better for her, only to realize that not only is she just back in the same situation she was in, no, it's actually worse because now she's being treated like a servant in her own household and she has no support anymore. It is that pointlessness that makes all of this just hurt so much more. And once again, we have no specific idea of how old Zezolla is supposed to be when all of this goes down. She could be 5, she could be 15 for all we know. Either Carmosina was always secretly evil from the start, or she simply didn't think that she had the opportunity to improve her situation until Zezolla told her point blank, "I want you to marry my dad," and then revealed her true colors. The fact that there are 6 stepsisters in this telling rather than the standard 2 is definitely a shift. And yes, we do have names for all of them. Imperia, Calamita or Calamita, Fiorella, Diamante, Colombina, and Pascarella. Italy, I am so sorry. But I'm going to say something potentially quite bold. I don't think that the stepsisters deserve to be villainized the way they are in this version. Hear me out! After she receives the date tree, Zezolla really only seems to be concerned with her stepsisters rather than the other antagonists. And the whole story ends with a spotlight on them, like this should be the moment that they learn their lesson. But Basile's main concern with what makes the stepsisters quote-unquote bad is that they're jealous of Zezolla. And that's kind of it. This theme of envy being someone's downfall comes up like bookends in this telling. It sort of reminds me of the morals that Charles Perrault added to his fairy tales. At the beginning, we have this little prelude. In the sea of malice, envy frequently gets out of her depth. And whilst she is expecting to see another drowned, she is either drowned herself or is dashed against a rock, as happened to some envious girls, about whom I will tell you a story. Which honestly sets some false expectations. The drowning or dashing against a rock, to me, conveys some sort of punishment or comeuppance for said envy. But nothing like that actually happens in this story to any of the antagonists. Zezolla is announced to be queen, and the rest of them kind of go, "Ah, nuts," and just go home. It's very anticlimactic. And the characters in the Pentamerone framing story apparently thought so as well, because when it pulls back into that world, they considered the punishment for Carmosina's daughters far too trifling. For there is no punishment which pride does not deserve, no misfortune that envy does not merit. What kind of punishment does manipulating little girls into committing murder merit? Now, yes, the stepsisters are envious, and because of that, they are forced to watch Zezolla get the thing that they wanted. But they never actually do anything as a result of their envy. Basile provides basically no textual evidence that the stepsisters even mistreat Zezolla in any way. They seem to be just going on about their lives, and it's Carmosina who is convincing the father to dote on them and subsequently lose the love he has for his own daughter. And it's also very vague how the riches to ragsening of Zezolla actually happens or who instigates it. In short, it fared so ill with the poor girl, bad today and worse tomorrow, that she was at last brought down from the royal chamber to the kitchen, from the canopy of the state to the hearth, from splendid apparel of silks and gold to dishclouts, from the scepter to the spit. Basile, if you want me to think that someone deserves punishment, you gotta show me the Carfax, babe. And speaking of hot takes, I don't even think we have a reason to believe the first stepmother was that bad either. Now, there's a scale of badness that we're looking at here. I'm not saying that she was secretly a saint and Zezolla was just having a bad adjustment period. The narration does describe the first stepmother as having a violent dislike for Zezolla, but I read that use of violent as a synonym for passionate rather than actually enacting physical harm. Beyond that, all that we have clear textual evidence for is that the first stepmother gives her dirty looks, and that's it. Now, Carmosina, while she is giving poor Zezolla her murder instructions, describes the stepmother as she who would like of all things to see you go in rags and tatters, in reference to the old dress that Zezolla would be asking for out of the chest. But as far as I'm concerned, that is just hearsay. And frankly, should we be trusting anything that comes out of this woman's mouth? At the end of the day, I am chalking this up to Basile simply trying to make us believe what he wants about these characters rather than actually showing us proof. I know that going on about textual evidence or lack thereof when we're talking about literal fairy tales might seem a bit like taking things too seriously, but I think my pedantism and frustration ultimately comes from the fact that we are seeing such a small piece of the puzzle here. Again, this started from oral tradition. Things got passed around and changed, spreading across cultures, and with each storyteller, naturally, the perception of the story changed, even by just a little bit. And anybody who actually had the foresight to collect these tales and write them down were not only giving us a snapshot, essentially, of what the tale generally looked like at the time, but they themselves are retelling it and adding their own flavoring to the pot. And when the writer is annoyingly vague about certain things, it's harder to tell if that was the case for most storytellers at the time, or if they were just trying to appease everyone by finding some sort of middle ground, or if they just didn't care to go into specifics. Now, when it comes to Zezolla, Cinderella herself, this incarnation to me feels the most like a fairy tale character. And I mean that in like the classical bordering on spooky sense. She starts out very human, very easy to feel for, and then after her father marries Carmosina, this sort of shift happens. She goes from being innocent and maybe even a little bit naive to someone who is incredibly aware of the world around her, almost to a supernatural degree. When she tells her father to do this one thing for her on this trip and warns him that if he doesn't, he won't be able to travel home, that does not sound like the same girl who was sobbing in her governess's lap because her new stepmom looked at her funny. Now, whether she actually caused the ship to not move, up for debate. Honestly, I think if she had that kind of power at her disposal, then she wouldn't need a fairy in a tree to sneak out of the house once in a while. And also, the shiny stuff that she drops to distract the king's servant, apparently she deliberately asked the date tree for those things to use just for that purpose. Either she knew that she was such hot stuff that at least someone was going to try and follow her home, or she knew specifically that the king was going to send someone after her. Her brain is constantly like 3 chess moves ahead of everybody else. And to me, it very much reads that she became that way because of Carmosina's lies and manipulation. She doesn't seem damaged in the way that Aschenputtel is from the German telling, thank God. We don't have any bird-induced violence here. The ending is actually quite peaceful, especially considering where we began. But notice that we have the dove motif occurring here as well. There's the dove who visits Zezolla at the wedding, and of course the dove of the fairies. Okay, I need to talk about the prince. Who was surprised? No one. Or actually, he's a king in this version. I would say he's more similar to how the love interest is portrayed in the Grimm's tale, but we do have some stark differences, for better and for worse. To add to the list of things that Basile conveniently does not care about, it's never stated if the king actually dances with Zezolla at any of the balls, or even exchanges 2 words with her. So the fact that he's so adamant his servant track her down and learn about her is a bit unnerving, although there is no flagrant misuse of tar. Then, when he gets Zezolla's slipper, he goes into this speech that I can only describe as incredibly thirsty. If the basement indeed is so beautiful, what must the building be? Oh, beauteous candlestick, where is the candle that consumes me? Oh, tripod of the bright boiler in which life simmers. Oh, beautiful cork, fastened to the angling line of love with which he has caught my soul. Lo, I embrace you, I press you to my heart, and if I cannot reach the plant, I adore at least the roots. If I cannot possess the capital of the column, I kiss the base. You, who until now were the prison of a white foot, are now the fetter of an unhappy heart. I had to experience it, so all of you do as well. See, this is why people make the foot fetish joke in the first place. So he's still kinda creepy, but at the end of the day, I don't think he's as bad as the Grimm's prince, and a lot of that judgment honestly rides on the fact that when Zezolla's father is trying to back out of bringing her to the slipper fitting, the king just looks him dead in the eye and said, she'll be first in line. There's actually a lot in this version that clearly ended up influencing what the Grimms collected. I actually think that the similarities between this and Perrault's version are pretty faint. It's got that darker overall tone, the gift from the father's trip, 3 balls, no midnight curfew, as well as the dove motif. But there is one element where you can very equally see where both the German and the French inspiration came from, and that is Cinderella's method of assistance, if you will. I'd never heard the exact phrase dove of the fairies before I read this, and trying to research it just kept leading me back to the same story, but just from context clues, I can infer that she has some sort of position of power compared to most fairies. The asking a tree for a dress is definitely still present in the German version, but in this case there's also a legit fairy canonically living inside of the tree. And this is a tree that she received as a gift from the dove of the fairies. In both instances, you can draw a pretty straight line to the typical fairy godmother that we're more familiar with. It's literally like we've got a whole molecule in the Italian version, and then France took one atom and Germany took another, which is really, really cool to see. After covering both Perrault and the Grimms, it's very easy for me to look at this story and notice how similar it is to those more familiar versions of the tale, and that it maybe just needed a bit more time in the oven. But at the same time, especially in the first half, this almost feels more like what I found myself calling a Cinderella cousin. Something that falls under the Cinderella tale type, but it's not quite the same story for whatever reason. Ultimately, I'm not sad that the more unique elements of this version, namely how a minor commits murder, seem to have gotten left behind in the shuffle. Don't get me wrong, I get a kick out of fairy tales that are ridiculously complicated for no reason. Do me a favor and go watch The Fox Princess from Hungarian Folktales. You will see exactly what I'm talking about. But I think the most effective fairy tales are the ones that are simple. It's harder to accomplish more with less. And I don't even think Basile fully understood what this story was trying to accomplish, because the moral feels so stuck on after the fact. Maybe that's my final hot take of the day. Basile just lacked a good editor. And with that, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope maybe you learned something. Let me know in the comments, are you Team Perrault, Team Grimm, or Team Basile? You can show your support for this video by giving it a like, and if you're interested in seeing me talk about other Cinderella related things, there will be links to the playlist on the end screen and in the description. And of course, if you would like to see new episodes when they come out, then feel free to subscribe. But for now, I think I'm about to turn into a pumpkin, so I will see you next time. Bye!